On a humid Thursday morning in July of 1987, three men from the Federal Land Bank stood beside a dying cornfield in Pemiscot County, Missouri, and told 73-year-old Walter Boone that the land was finished. Not struggling, not damaged, finished. The stalks around them barely reached a man's waist. Leaves curled inward like burned paper. The dirt had turned dark and heavy after weeks of strange underground seepage from an abandoned drainage canal north of the property line. Farmers across the county called it poison soil. Some claimed it smelled like rust after rain. Others said nothing could grow there again for 20 years. Walter listened quietly. The oldest banker wiped sweat from his neck with a folded handkerchief and looked over the field again before speaking. You'd make more money selling this acreage for flood mitigation than planting another crop. Walter Boone nodded once. Then he looked down at the dirt beneath his boots and said something nobody there understood at the time. You boys are mistaking wet ground for dead ground. That sentence followed those men for the next 11 years. Because 3 months later, helicopters would descend over Walter Boone's farm while television crews crowded the county roads outside his land. And by then, nobody was laughing anymore. Let me tell you about Walter Boone. He bought his first acreage in 1949. 6 months after returning from Europe with a damaged left knee and a toolbox, he carried home from a military motor pool outside Antwerp. He started with 30 acres near Haiti, Missouri, growing soybeans and feed corn beside his father's property. By 1958, he had expanded to 112 acres, most of it low river bottom land other farmers avoided because it flooded every few years. But Walter understood water differently. Most men fought it. Walter studied it. He kept notebooks filled with rainfall measurements going back to Eisenhower's first term. He dug trenches by hand. He mapped underground drainage with wooden stakes and twine. During winters, while other men sat inside feed stores drinking coffee, Walter walked frozen fields with a steel probe rod testing soil density, one hole at a time. People called him obsessive, but they also noticed something else. During dry years, Walter's crops survived longer. During wet years, his fields drained faster. And in 1964, he bought the machine that would eventually make him famous across southeast Missouri. A 1953 Minneapolis-Moline UB Special, 46 horsepower, 5,800 pounds of solid steel and cast iron, purchase used from a retiring farmer outside Sikeston for $1,900 cash. The tractor already had 8,000 field hours on it when Walter bought it. Most men would have passed, but Walter crawled underneath with a flashlight, inspected the transmission housing, checked the oil pan bolts himself, then handed over the money without negotiating a dollar. That tractor became part of the land. Its yellow paint faded almost white under Missouri's sun. The seat tore open sometime during the Carter administration, and Walter repaired it using leather cut from an old horse saddle. Every winter he drained the fluids himself, changed every seal by hand, and coated exposed metal with grease before covering it under canvas inside his machine shed. His grandson once asked him why he never traded it in for something modern. Walter smiled. Because this tractor tells me when something's wrong before it breaks. By the summer of 1987, almost nobody in Pemiscot County still used machines like that. The younger farmers drove enclosed John Deere 4440s with air conditioning and cassette radios. They planted faster, covered more acreage, took bigger loans, bigger risks. One of those younger men was Dale Mercer, 36 years old, agricultural consultant, Missouri State graduate, sharp haircut, crisp boots, brand new Chevrolet Scottsdale pickup with chrome wheels and a company logo painted on the door. Dale worked with regional lenders evaluating distressed farmland, and when he first saw Walter Boone's property in June of 1987, he laughed before even stepping out of the truck. Not because Walter looked poor, because the field looked hopeless. Black patches spread through the rows like bruises under skin. The drainage ditch nearby bubbled after heavy rains. Corn roots rotted before reaching depth. Several neighboring farms had already stopped planting sections near the canal entirely. Dale walked the field with 2 local officials, while Walter followed behind carrying a shovel over one shoulder. You can smell the minerals, Dale said. Ground's contaminated. Walter pushed the shovel into the dirt and lifted a chunk slowly. "No," he said calmly. Ground's waking up. That made the others laugh. Not politely, not nervously. One man slapped his thigh. Another shook his head and looked away smiling. Dale himself bent over slightly, boots sinking into mud, while he laughed hard enough to remove his sunglasses. "Waking up," he said. "Walter, this land's drowning." Walter never raised his voice, never defended himself. He simply broke apart the soil with his thumb and let the darker dirt fall through his fingers. Then he looked directly at Dale Mercer and asked one quiet question. "Son, have you ever seen river bottom earth after 30 years without oxygen?" Nobody answered. The wind moved through the dead-looking corn around them with a dry, rattling sound. And Walter smiled very slightly. That evening, several men repeated the story inside a diner along Highway 412. They joked about the old farmer talking to dirt like it was alive. Somebody called the field Boone Swamp. Another man claimed Walter had finally gone senile from working alone too long. Dale laughed with him at first, but later that night, he couldn't stop thinking about the question, "Have you ever seen river bottom earth after 30 years without oxygen?" Because the truth was he hadn't. You have to understand something about that region in the late 1980s. Much of southeastern Missouri had been altered by aggressive drainage projects dating back to the 1920s. Wetlands disappeared. Swamps became farmland. Channels redirected entire water systems. Thousands of acres transformed from marsh into crop fields almost overnight. But buried underneath some of that land remained ancient organic soil layers sealed away from air for decades. And under certain conditions, those layers could change completely once exposed. Most people never saw it happen. Walter Boone believed he was seeing it now. Let me tell you about the drainage canal north of his property. Built in 1931 by county contractors using mule teams and steam excavators, the canal originally diverted seasonal floodwater away from cotton acreage during the Depression. But by the late 1970s, sections collapsed underground after years of neglect. Water started seeping sideways beneath neighboring farms instead of flowing south as designed. Most farmers saw a disaster. Walter saw movement. He spent weeks digging test trenches near the seepage lines. He carried mason jars filled with black soil samples into his machine shed and studied them under hanging fluorescent lights late into the night. Then he stopped planting one entire corner of the property altogether. That decision nearly ruined him financially. By August, his corn yield projections dropped below 70 bushels per acre, while neighboring farms averaged 135. The bank started preparing foreclosure papers on 32 acres bordering the drainage canal. Dale Mercer returned twice that month. The second time, he brought aerial photographs. The third time, he brought contracts. And during that third visit, Walter Boone did something nobody expected. He started plowing deeper into the dead field using the old Minneapolis-Moline. Not shallow rows, deep cuts, almost 20 inches down. The tractor groaned across the black soil under blazing heat, while neighbors stopped their trucks along the county road to watch. "Crazy old fool," someone muttered. But Walter kept plowing, hour after hour, day after day. Then on September 3rd, 1987, a helicopter appeared over the Boone property for the first time. And Walter Boone looked up at the sky like he'd been expecting it all along. The helicopter belonged to Missouri Department of Natural Resources. White body, green stripe, Bell 206 Jet Ranger. It circled Walter Boone's property twice before landing near the drainage canal north of the cornfield. Dust rolled across the roads while neighbors gathered beside the county road, watching from pickup beds and fence lines. Nobody in Pemiscot County had ever seen state officials arrive by helicopter for farmland, especially dead farmland. Dale Mercer stepped out of his truck, just as two environmental surveyors climbed from the aircraft carrying metal cases and sampling tubes. He adjusted his cap against the rotor wash and stared toward Walter, who stood beside the old Minneapolis-Moline with both hands resting on the steering wheel, calm as ever, like he already knew what they were going to find. One of the surveyors introduced himself as Harold Pritchard and explained that unusual underground readings had been detected during floodplain mapping south of the county canal system. The black soil beneath Walter's property showed abnormally high organic density, levels unlike anything nearby. Most people listening didn't understand what that meant. Walter did. Let me tell you about river bottom peat. Long before southeastern Missouri became soybean country, much of it was swamp forest, cypress, willow, cottonwood, water standing still for generations. When plants died, they sank beneath oxygen-poor water and slowly compressed into dense organic layers packed with carbon and nutrients. Properly drained and exposed, that kind of soil could become unbelievably fertile. But almost nobody alive in 1987 had ever farmed it directly. The land had been buried too long. The state believed part Walter Boone's field sat directly above one of those forgotten layers. That afternoon, survey crews pushed steel core samplers 22 feet into the earth, while Walter watched silently from the shade of the tractor shed. Dale Mercer stayed close beside the officials. Try to understand why the same field he had classified as near worthless now had government scientists kneeling in it with notebooks. Around sunset, one of the tubes emerged black as coal. Not mud, not clay, rich organic peat. Harold Pritchard rubbed the sample between his fingers and looked toward Walter. How long did you suspect this? Walter shrugged once. About 6 weeks. Dale stared at him. You based this on 6 weeks? Walter shook his head. No, I base it on 40 years. That answer stayed with Dale, because suddenly the old man didn't look stubborn anymore. He looked observant. That night, news spread through 3 counties. The next morning, reporters arrived. Then more officials. Then university researchers from Columbia. Within days, the same people who laughed at Walter Boone's dead field were walking carefully through it while taking photographs. And the old farmer never once said, "I told you so." Instead, he kept working. Every sunrise, the Minneapolis-Moline rolled back into the field, pulling a 5-shank sub so Walter modified himself, using salvaged steel from a grain elevator demolition in 1974. The tool cut deep channels beneath the surface, allowing trapped water to escape, while exposing the buried organic layers slowly instead of all at once. The machine looked ancient beside the newer tractors parked nearby, but it never stopped pulling. Have you ever owned something everybody else called outdated? Something slow, ugly, old-fashioned, but deep down you trusted it more than anything modern because it had already proven itself during the worst days of your life? That was Walter's tractor, and maybe that's why people couldn't stop watching it. Let me tell you something most people misunderstand about old farm engines. Horsepower sells tractors. Torque keeps them moving. Modern engines often produce higher horsepower at higher RPMs, but older cast-iron tractors, like the Minneapolis-Moline UB, produced heavy low-end torque at slower speeds. That mattered in deep, wet soil, because fast-spinning wheels only dig holes. Steady torque keeps traction. The weight of old steel transfers power differently through soft ground. Modern tractors float better, but old machines bite harder when conditions turn difficult. Walter understood that instinctively. By late September, portions of the field started changing. The black earth dried into dark chocolate-colored rows, unlike anything nearby. Corn roots deepened. Weak stalks thickened unexpectedly. Areas previously considered dead began outperforming neighboring acreage planted weeks earlier. People stopped joking about Boone Swamp. Now, they called it Boone Ground. Dale Mercer visited almost daily by then. At first, he came for work. Later, he came because he genuinely wanted to learn. One evening, he found Walter inside the machine shed replacing a hydraulic seal under a hanging work light. "You knew before any of us," Dale admitted quietly. Walter slid a wrench across the floor. "No," he said. "I just stayed long enough to notice." That hit Dale harder than he expected, because he suddenly realized something uncomfortable. Most younger consultants like him only saw land through reports, quarterly projections, satellite images, and loan risk percentages. Walter saw it through seasons, through smell, through texture, through 40 winters and 40 floods. One measured land from distance. The other measured from memory. 3 weeks later, the state released preliminary findings. Walter Boone's field contained one of the richest exposed peat soil deposits discovered in Missouri farmland during the decade. Agricultural researchers estimated the organic density could dramatically improve long-term yields if managed correctly. Television crews returned again. This time, they interviewed Walter directly. The reporter asked him what it felt like proving everyone wrong. Walter looked embarrassed by the question. Then he answered softly, "Land talks slow. Most people just leave before it finishes speaking." That clip aired across Missouri, and suddenly the quiet old farmer from Pemiscot County became something unexpected, respected, but not everybody celebrated. Because the moment state reports confirmed the land's value, outside investors started circling the property. Agricultural development companies offered Walter enormous sums for drilling rights, research partnerships, and commercial leases tied to soil extraction studies. One company from St. Louis offered nearly $480,000 for 60 acres, more money than Walter Boone had seen in his entire life. Dale Mercer himself advised taking the deal. "You could retire comfortably," he told him. Walter tightened a bolt on the tractor wheel. "What would I retire from?" "Work." Walter looked confused. "This isn't work." Then October arrived, and with it came the flood. 3 straight days of rain hammered southeastern Missouri. Drainage canals overflowed. Newly harvested soybean fields disappeared underwater. Several neighboring farms lost entire sections of topsoil overnight. County officials issued emergency warnings near the lowlands. Dale Mercer drove toward Walter's property through heavy rain, expecting disaster. Instead, he found something impossible. Walter Boone's field was draining perfectly. Water moved through the deep subsoil channels and ancient peat layers exactly the way Walter predicted. While neighboring properties flooded knee-deep, the Boone field absorbed and redirected runoff naturally beneath the surface. The black earth held. The roads around it did not. By midnight, emergency crews requested access through Walter's property because surrounding routes had become impassable. Then, just before dawn, another helicopter descended through the storm clouds carrying state emergency officials. And this time, they weren't there to inspect the field. They were there because Walter Boone had become the only man in the county who understood how the land underneath the flood was actually moving. Rain hammered the roof of Walter Boone's machine shed hard enough to drown conversation. The helicopter lights flashed across the soaked cornfield while emergency officials unfolded county maps over the hood of Dale Mercer's truck. Entire sections of Highway 84 had flooded by then. Drainage channels backed into farm roads. Water crossed fields that had stayed dry for 40 years. But Walter Boone kept staring at one specific point on the map. An old canal branch no longer marked on modern surveys. "You still got the 1938 drainage charts?" he asked. One official blinked. "How do you know about those?" Walter reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded paper worn soft from age. Because he carried a copy himself. "Let me tell you about old farmers and paper maps. Before satellites. Before computer imaging. Before digital soil analysis. Men like Walter Boone learned land through county surveys drawn by hand, water routes, clay beds, sand ridges, buried creek lines. Those maps stayed folded in glove compartments for decades because experienced farmers understood something engineers sometimes forgot. Land remembers where water used to go, and during floods, it tries to go there again. Walter spread the old chart flat against the truck hood while rainwater collected along the edges. His finger traced an abandoned drainage route beneath 3 neighboring farms toward a collapsed culvert west of the Boone property. "If this canal opens," he said quietly, "everything north of us flood by morning." The emergency coordinator looked skeptical. The younger engineers looked confused. But Dale Mercer didn't laugh this time. Because every prediction Walter Boone made so far had come true. The county authorized excavation crews within the hour, and at 2:30 in the morning, under portable floodlights and pounding rain, Walter Boone climbed onto the old Minneapolis-Moline UB Special for what would become the most famous night of its life. The tractor coughed once, then roared awake. Yellow headlights cut through the storm while the old machine dragged excavation blades toward the collapsed canal bank. Mud swallowed modern loaders almost immediately. Their lighter frames spun uselessly against the saturated ground. But Walter's tractor kept moving, slowly, relentlessly. 5,800 pounds of steel pressing into earth with every rotation. Dale stood ankle-deep in water, watching the 73-year-old farmer work the controls with steady hands while rain poured from the brim of his hat. "You should let somebody younger do this," Dale shouted. Walter didn't even look back. "Then find somebody older than this tractor." For 6 straight hours, the Minneapolis-Moline carved emergency channels through the floodplain, while county crews reinforced drainage points with gravel and culvert pipe. Helicopters circled overhead, using spotlights to guide equipment through darkness. And by sunrise, the floodwater changed direction. Not everywhere, but enough. Enough to save 200 acres north of the county road. Enough to protect 3 farmhouses. Enough to stop the canal breach before it destroyed half the valley. When daylight finally broke the clouds, exhausted crews stood silently watching water rush through the emergency channels Walter Boone designed overnight using 40-year-old maps and memory. One state engineer removed his gloves and shook his head slowly. "We would have lost the whole eastern section." Walter just shut off the tractor engine. The silence afterward felt enormous. News crews arrived before noon. This time they didn't come looking for a curiosity story about strange dirt. They came because emergency officials publicly credited Walter Boone's knowledge with preventing catastrophic flood damage during one of the worst October storms southeastern Missouri had seen in years. The footage spread everywhere. Old farmer, ancient tractor, government helicopters, overhead. Floodwater moving behind him while reporters crowded muddy roads trying to understand how a man everyone mocked 3 months earlier suddenly became the county's most trusted voice. And then came the moment Dale Mercer would remember for the rest of his life. A television reporter asked Walter how it felt proving modern experts wrong. Walter looked genuinely uncomfortable again. Then he answered carefully, "They weren't wrong. They just got here later than I did." No bitterness. No arrogance. Just truth. That answer changed something in Dale, because for the first time in years, he realized expertise and wisdom weren't the same thing. One came from education. The other came from staying. Have you ever known you were standing beside somebody the world underestimated completely? Somebody quiet enough to disappear in ordinary life until the exact moment their knowledge became irreplaceable? That was Walter Boone in October of 1987. And the entire county knew it now. Over the next several months, agricultural researchers continued studying the Boone property. Yield tests on the restored soil showed extraordinary recovery rates. By spring planting season in 1988, sections once declared worthless produced stronger early growth than neighboring farms untouched by seepage. Investors kept calling. Universities kept visiting. But Walter refused almost every commercial offer placed in front of him. Instead, he spent most mornings rebuilding drainage systems across nearby farms damaged during flood. For free, Dale Mercer started helping him. Not because he had to, because he wanted to learn. The 2 men became an unlikely pair around Pemiscot County. Walter in faded overalls beside the old Minneapolis-Moline. Dale following behind with engineering reports, notebooks, and county survey copies tucked under one arm. One afternoon while repairing runoff trenches near Carruthersville, Dale finally asked a question bothering him for months. "Why didn't you sell when they offered all that money?" Walter tightened a rusted bolt before answering. "Because land ain't mine to cash out." Dale frowned slightly. "Then what is it?" Walter looked across the field. "Borrowed." That sentence stayed with Dale even longer than the first one. Borrowed. Not owned. Borrowed from the people before you. Borrowed from the people after you. Let me tell you about the machine shed behind Walter Boone's farmhouse. Inside sat 50 years of careful survival. Coffee cans filled with labeled bolts. Fan belts hanging from nails. Manuals wrapped in wax paper. Old bearings coated in grease cloth. Every repair ever made to the Minneapolis-Moline recorded in pencil inside a ledger dating back to 1964. Walter treated maintenance like memory. Nothing discarded carelessly. Nothing replaced thoughtlessly. The tractor itself had become almost legendary by then. Visitors drove from neighboring counties just to see it. Some expected a miracle machine. Instead, they found worn paint, oil stains, scratches, repairs layered over repairs. A working tractor. That was the point. It survived because somebody kept caring whether it survived. In December 1988, the Missouri Farm Bureau invited Walter Boone to speak during a regional conservation conference in Columbia. He almost refused, said he had chores. Dale convinced him to go. When Walter finally stood behind the podium wearing his only brown suit jacket, the room expected a polished speech about environmental recovery and agricultural science. Instead, Walter spoke for 9 minutes, mostly about listening. Listening to old farmers, listening to old land, listening before problems became emergencies. And near the end, he looked directly at the younger men sitting near the front rows and said something nobody in that room forgot. Fast decisions make fast money. Slow decisions make farms. The room stayed silent after he finished. Then people stood, one by one at first. Then almost everybody, except Walter Boone, never saw the standing ovation, because by then he had already quietly stepped away from the podium and walked outside toward the parking lot, where snow had started falling beside the old Minneapolis-Moline, waiting under a layer of white. By the spring of 1993, 6 years after the helicopters first landed over Walter Boone's field, agricultural colleges across Missouri were still referencing the Boone drainage recovery during conservation seminars. Not because it was dramatic, because it worked. The restored peat-rich acreage on Walter's property consistently produced some of the strongest corn yields in Pemiscot County. In 1992, one 80-acre section averaged 178 bushels per acre during a season many neighboring farms struggled to reach 130. The same land people once called dead had become some of the most productive soil in the region. But Walter Boone still farmed it exactly the same way. Slow, careful, watching the weather before sunrise with a coffee cup in one hand, checking soil by touch instead of relying only on reports. And every winter, without fail, maintaining the old Minneapolis-Moline inside the machine shed behind the farmhouse. Dale Mercer became part of those winters. At first he visited occasionally, then weekly, eventually almost every Saturday morning. The younger consultant who once laughed at Walter in front of county officials now sat beside him rebuilding carburetors, replacing bearings, and studying handwritten notebooks dating back 40 years. One January afternoon in 1994, Dale noticed something written inside the repair ledger beside an entry from October 1987. Flood night. Tractor never failed once. Dale looked up from the notebook. You really thought this machine would hold together in that storm? Walter smiled faintly. No. Dale seemed surprised. No. Walter wiped grease from his hands with a red shop rag. I just knew it wouldn't quit before I did. That was Walter Boone in a single sentence. Never dramatic, never loud, just steady. The years moved quietly after that. The attention faded first, then the reporters, then the researchers. As always, the world eventually moved on to newer stories. But people around Pemiscot County remembered, especially during flood seasons, whenever heavy rain threatened the lowlands. County crews still consulted old Boone drainage charts stored in the courthouse basement. Younger farmers who once dismissed Walter started restoring neglected runoff channels across their own properties. Several even switched back to deeper subsoil management techniques based on the methods Walter demonstrated after the 1987 flood. And slowly, something unexpected happened. Dale Mercer changed too. By 1996, he left corporate agricultural consulting entirely and opened a small independent land management office outside Haiti, focused on conservation planning and flood-resilient farming. He spent less time selling acreage and more time helping families hold on to it. People noticed the difference. One local banker joked that Dale had turned into Walter Boone with better boots. Dale took it as a compliment. Have you ever met somebody who changed your understanding of success completely? Not through speeches, not through force, just by living differently long enough that eventually you started questioning your own pace, your own priorities, your own idea of what mattered. That was Walter's real legacy. Not the helicopters, not the headlines. Perspective. Let me tell you what happened to the Minneapolis-Moline UB Special. By the late 1990s, collectors started offering serious money for restored vintage tractors. Some rare Minneapolis-Moline models, sold for over $20,000 at auctions across the Midwest. Dale once asked Walter whether he'd ever consider repainting the tractor and showing it publicly. Walter looked horrified. Why would I paint over honest work? The machine remained exactly as it always had been. Faded yellow, worn seat, steel polished smooth where Walter's boots climbed aboard thousands of times over 4 decades. Every dent carried memory. Every repair carried history. In August of 1998, Walter Boone planted what would become his final full corn crop at the age of 84. Dale handled more of the physical labor by then, but Walter still rode the tractor almost daily during planting season. Neighbors noticed he moved slower, but never carelessly. That October, after harvest finished, Walter sat outside the machine shed watching sunset over the same black earth everyone once called ruined. Dale brought him coffee and asked whether he ever regretted staying for the hard years instead of selling when land prices rose. Walter thought about it for a long moment. Then he shook his head. Leaving's expensive, too. Walter Boone passed away peacefully in February of 2001 during his afternoon nap beside the wood stove inside the farmhouse he had lived in since Truman was president. He was 87 years old. At the funeral, farmers lined pickup trucks along the church road for nearly half a mile. Some brought soil samples from their own farms in mason jars because Walter taught them how to study drainage properly. Others came simply because they remembered the flood, and almost all of them remembered the laugh. The moment people mocked the old farmer standing in dead-looking corn while holding black dirt in his hands. Dale Mercer spoke during the service. Halfway through, his voice nearly broke when he described the night Walter saved a valley with a 53-year-old tractor and a paper map older than both of them combined. After the funeral, Dale drove alone to the Boone farm. The machine shed still smelled like grease and old steel. Walter's repair ledger remained open on the workbench, exactly where he left it, and parked quietly beneath canvas sat the Minneapolis-Moline UB Special. Waiting, Dale uncovered it slowly, then climbed into the seat. The engine started on the second try. That spring, Dale planted the Boone fields himself under an agreement with Walter's daughter, Elaine, who inherited the property but chose to keep the farm operating exactly as her father wanted. No developers, no commercial extraction deals, no subdivisions, just farming, careful farming. By 2011, 10 years after Walter's death, local schools occasionally brought students to visit the Boone property during conservation field trips. Dale would stand near the old tractor, explaining drainage systems, while younger kids climbed onto wagon rails nearby, listening to stories about the flood. Most of them couldn't believe helicopters once landed there, but older farmers always could, because they remembered how quickly people confuse quietness with weakness. The Minneapolis-Moline still runs today. Same engine block, same transmission, same faded paint. Every October, Dale starts it during the first week of harvest season, whether the farm needs it or not, just to hear it work, just to remember. And maybe that's the real reason Walter Boone's story lasted longer than the headlines ever did. Because deep down, people know the world moves too fast and notice everything worth saving. Some things don't become valuable because the government arrives. They become valuable because one quiet person cared enough to stay when everyone else walked away. If you've ever known somebody like Walter Boone, somebody patient enough to trust experience over noise, somebody who kept working while the world laughed, tell me about them in the comments. I read every story. And if you want to hear about the Kentucky farmer who had a 1948 case VAC inside a tobacco barn for 14 years after the bank tried to seize it during the drought of 1956, that story is coming soon. You'll want to be here for it.